Years ago, I had a friend, older guy, who was a cook at a steakhouse. Now, here where I live, we had maybe three places you'd go for steaks, like in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. This was before the chains like Outback and all that stuff came on, way before them. But this place that he worked for so many years was known for their steaks. Tender, delicious, tasty, all this stuff. And I asked him one time, I said, we were talking about what it was like working there and all this. He said, most people don't realize what goes into a steak. Getting a good tender steak, tender piece of meat. I said, well, it's the animal, right? He says, no, it had nothing to do with that. He said they ordered their meat out of a supplier out of Nebraska. Big truck would come in, and they had 3 walk-in freezers. They take the meat in, cut all the meat, make all their cuts. They did all the cutting themselves. But they would cut the steaks and place them in trays. They wouldn't wrap them. So they got these steaks. They're all cut. They lay them on these trays. They put them into their walk-in reefers, and they would set the reefer at the mid-50s, talking degrees, 50, 55 degrees like that. Shouldn't be above 41 in your refrigerator. Well, they'd set these things in there in the mid-50s, and he said you'd usually take a day or two, and with depending on the thaw rate what they're at, and he said take a day or two, and then the steaks would start to bleed. Okay, start to see the blood coming out of the steaks in these trays. He said the following day you'd pick up the smell, and he said they would stink. They would just start to stink. So he says, you get your meats, you cut them, you lay them in the trays, you kick up your temperature. Steaks start to bleed. The next day they should stink, or just start to stink. He said anybody else would think, okay, oh gosh, we got to throw these away. This meat's bad. He goes, on that second day, on that first the bleeding, then the stink, they'd immediately shut everything down and crank the reefers way down to a deep freeze and freeze all the steak solid. And he said, that's how we got a tender steak. I said, well, what was going on? He says, well, once you kick those temperatures up and you allow those steaks exposed to the air, the putrefaction process starts out. These things start to rot in a sense. And he says what happens, it breaks down all the tissue and the fiber in that meat. And basically it's the rotting process which breaks down that meat and makes it more tender. He says you can take just about any piece of meat. He says if you stink it correctly, his words, you can make a tender steak out of it. And I said, that sounds really gross. He says, well, we didn't tell people that, but that's how we got a tender steak for 30 years. He said, people used to talk about aged beef. When they would take beef and hang it, they say, oh, they're aging it. No, they're letting it rot. It's that rot process, that putrefaction process that tenderizes all that meat and makes it more edible. He says, but they call it aged beef, so it sounds better. Well, no, it's rotten meat. But that's not a great marketing thing. You want to tell people you're rotting the meat. But it was that rotting of the meat that made it tender. And I said they had a reputation of 30 years of just great steaks, and they really did. Anyhow, bon appetit.